Okay, so Charles, thank you so much for agreeing to participate with us today. This is our Assembly Day, or Ubuntu Network Assembly Day, and we're coming together to share ideas around global citizenship education and how it might pertain to initial teacher education in Ireland. So there are three main questions, Charles, that I want to pose to you. As you know, we've been in operation since about 2006. And our
Yeah.
core function is to integrate education for sustainable development into initial teacher ed. So we're really excited that our new teacher standards, our new teacher education standards, I should say, have now included global citizenship education as a core mandatory component, which is really exciting for us.
Right.
But there's three main questions that we want to pose to you, Charles. And the first question is around reorienting teacher education to address sustainability. So sometimes we kind of look at what we do as curricular changes here and there. We try to integrate our changes across the whole teacher education program, but I'm really interested to know of your experiences of reorienting teacher education to make it really, really fundamentally around sustainability and social justice. So that's question one, maybe any experiences you have on that. Question two is a really big challenge that we have faced over a number of years and we continue to face, and that's around monitoring the effectiveness of what it is that we do. We know we make an impact on students, but really trying to measure it and trying to provide evidence, I suppose, to ourselves, but also to our funders that what we do makes a difference. It really has been challenging for us. So I'm interested to know if you have any insights into that or any good practices on that you might share with us. And then thirdly, the new UNESCO roadmap for 2030, for ESD to 2030, are there any particular areas in that you'd point us to that are particularly relevant for initial teacher education going forward?
Yeah, the whole idea of internationally what's happening around reorienting, there are two different ways of thinking about internationally. One would be what's happening in other countries, and the other is what's happening on the UN stage and so on. So, you know, in other countries, for instance, in trying to reorient, China has developed 1,000 experimental ESD schools looking at global citizenship, education for sustainable development, and even reorienting the whole concept of sustainable development around ecological civilization. You know, so trying to tailor it to the Chinese mindset of civilizations and so on. In the Asia Pacific region, and I'll come back to that, where led by Okayama University, you have about 18 or 20 countries with teacher education institutions working collaboratively to develop competencies of teachers. You know, there's all kinds of work around the competencies of students, but what are the competencies that in initial teacher education? The International Association of Universities has developed a program to react to the Sustainable Development Goals, putting together clusters representing all the different UN regions of the world of universities working on each of the individual clusters. And Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education is being led by our university and in particular our chair. So SDG 4 and so on. And I may be able to have time to come back to that. One of the really big things, though, that's happening internationally is the Times Higher Education ranking. However you feel about ranking, it has really finally the attention of higher administration. And as I say, whether you like it or not. So internationally, from institutions, there are two big movements. One is linked to the SDGs, right? That's me. And the other is linked to quality education itself. So those are two big sectors. So, and I'm going to talk about the SDG drivers first, and then I'll come back to the other. So I'll just take a moment and try and share my screen here, because yesterday was International Day of Education. Now, what is different about this is a full UN day. This is not a UNESCO day. It's only 3 years old. It was developed 3 years ago. And the focus is on promoting peace and sustainable development. Because the full UN, the UN General Assembly now, is engaged with trying to bring purpose to education. And that's very, very different. And it's around purpose, around sustainable development. Now, if very quickly, I think the term reorienting, that goes right back to the very beginning with the different ways in which sustainable development, whether it was right after the Second World War, looking at the role of education in trying to rebuild and try and shape the future. But from our perspective, we usually talk about 1987, when the full UN General Assembly adopted sustainable development as the big compromise between the North wanting environmental protection and the South wanting development, roughly. And then for 5 years, they worked on an implementation plan, which was called Agenda 21. And in Agenda 21, there were 40 chapters, 40 issues. Chapter 36 was using education, public awareness, and training as a means of implementing. And in looking at the roles, they took education and split it into two. So we had education, public awareness, and training with 4 sort of thrusts or aspects. And the first one was more education, education for all. Without education, an educated society wouldn't have any development, let alone, sustainable. But they realized it was our most educated nations that were creating a lot of the greatest problems. So the idea then was introduced. I was part of the writing team. There were a ton of us. And what we wanted to do was to reorient the purpose of education from development, a whole economic base, to sustainable development. And so while the first thrust was access and retention in quality education, the second one was reorienting the purpose of education itself. The third thrust was public awareness and understanding, and the fourth was training programs. Now, Agenda 21 ran until we had the opportunity of a new kickstart with the millennium. And so we then changed from the 40 thrusts down to 8. But still education, but from a perspective of more access was it, and it was only targeted to the least developing countries. That ran from 2000 to 2015, a 15-year block. We started to prepare for the next block, and we realized that just working on the least developed countries wouldn't work. The idea that we needed to address all nations. And we needed, again, to look at education for all. And so in 2012 to 2015, there was a short campaign called Global Education Initiative that came out, and it looked at, yes, more, second, reorienting, right? And the third, global citizenship perspectives. And that went into 2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then when you get into parallel, you can see very quickly in 1990, we had Education for All. In 2000, we had the Millennium Development Goals for the least. And then in 2015, with the Sustainable Development Goals, we've blended the two thrusts together. Education for all has been subsumed into the Sustainable Development Goals as it goes along. Now, the way of looking at education, for instance, if you, as an enabler of them all, and I'll come back to this again in a second, but you can't look at the Sustainable Development Goals in isolation. It's like a patchwork blanket or quilt. One patch doesn't really help you on a cold night. You need the whole integrated approach. And so if you take COVID, you can see this slide put out by the UN General Assembly, really pushing that we look in an integrated way with them. And none is more integrated than the role of education. So if you look at education itself, yes, we have the one, but it is part of them all. And the other thing is in a context now of not just three things of social, environmental, and economic, but now it's the social becomes people, the economic becomes prosperity, the environmental becomes planet, and then to that we see this cannot be done just by government. So the whole idea of partnerships, which includes NGOs like Ubuntu and so on. And then the goal of looking at peace. Now, within Sustainable Development Goal 4, there are 7 targets and 3 means of implementation. And you're saying, okay, what does this do really with teacher education? One, which you can look at is 4.10, which really is called C, is increasing the number of teachers. But within 4.7, it's interesting that they identified the knowledge and skill for sustainable development. And in that, it identifies at 4.7, if you go into it, the actual UN document identifies education for sustainable development, including sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, etc., and global citizenship. The UN doesn't mention math, language, history, geography, that sort of thing. But these are key issues because they are a means of implementation. But the UN General Assembly has also recognized on 2 occasions, in 2017 and 2019, that education for sustainable development, not just education itself, but reaffirms education for sustainable development as a vital means of implementation, but also as an integral element of the Sustainable Development Goal on quality education and a key enabler of all the other Sustainable Development Goals. So this hoists it really up in importance. So these two had been moving along in parallel, and now they're being brought together. It's fine if you have those with a background in global citizenship education and those who have a background and so on, they can continue to work on it. But from the perspective of the classroom teacher or the professor, you can't bring in these 100 different adjectival educations that are floating around out there. I know superintendent curriculum, my job was to try and keep them out of the curriculum so people could focus, right? So how do we blend these together and bring them in an integrated way and bring them to the attention of our school systems? Now, in monitoring and trying to figure out what is effective, I mentioned what was going on in Asia Pacific for the last couple of years with these 20 countries, with people from faculties of education and so on coming together. They felt that the indicators put out by the UN for the Sustainable Development Goals really didn't hit the target. And they wanted to develop their own, where they had some kind of control over what it was they were doing, relevancy, how they could bring about change to address that, and so on. And they came up with 3 different domains. It's really a very, very interesting document that they are doing action research in trying to implement. But there was a domain on focusing on teachers' own learning, right? And the domain on creativity, the use of IT, that sort of thing, the domain around connecting, collaborating, so on. But they also developed quite a checklist for monitoring their own progress and how to go forward. So I would encourage the that Ubuntu really sort of look at what makes sense in an Irish context, and what is achievable, what's doable, what is really holding things back, and how we can go from there. Now, the other thing, if I could go back, sorry. The underlying thing at the international level also is that getting up to Sustainable Development Goal 4, there was that other process of quality education itself, kind of separate from the Sustainable Development Goals, but looking at doing this from an education point of view, not just to implement sustainability. Can you really have a quality education if it doesn't address a sustainable future, and so on? And so at the preparation, just as they were launching the Sustainable Development Goals, the parallel process was the Aichi Nagoya Declaration, and then the Incheon Declaration for ministers of education from around the world. And they said, we really do need to review the purposes and values that underpin education. In other words, the reorienting, to question and either reaffirm what we're doing or saying, okay, things really do need to change. Now, they didn't anticipate the disruptor of COVID, which is giving us a tremendous opportunity, you know, to really shake things up. And the second thing where it really ties in to teacher education is, once again, they identify the key to all this. You can't work with the world's 80 million teachers, but you can engage and work with those who are preparing the new teachers and delivering the in-service programs. The thing that is really recommended now is the idea of a whole institution approach, where we look at collaboration, partnerships, and so on, both with schools and with the outside world, looking at the institution in its core of governance and so on, looking at the 3 core elements, the program, which really is teaching and learning, research, and community service. And then how do we actually embed this? How do we model it? How do we look at our institutions as living laboratories, and so on? These are all components of it. Also, then you asked me to think a little bit about the roadmap. The roadmap with its 5 priorities, almost all 5 of them engage teacher education. Especially if you look at priority 3, that's really where it stands out. How do we build the capacity of educators? I find it very interesting that 4.7 begins with saying all learners shall, by 2030. Good teachers are learners too. We have to think back to ourselves. Teachers as learning with people, especially as in the world of emerging issues, the wicked issues that are coming forward. How do we prepare? an appropriate education. But the role that we have in the second priority of transforming learning environments, you know, it's key. The mobilizing and empowering young people, it's so important, because not only is it now appropriate to teach about, but it's to teach for and to engage people, whether it's Fridays for Future or whatever it is. How do we give them the skills, the civic skills, and so on? I remember the work that Anne Looney was doing years ago, you know, with preparing people with a voice, getting the young students. So those are the important things. But the big issue, and I'm getting close to closing, I'm sorry, but the timing. It's how do we engage mainstream education? You know, and I think bringing together the idea of quality education with the thrust for the Sustainable Development Goals, because education leaders don't see Sustainable Development Goals as job one, but they do see quality education as the main job. And so if we look at the kinds of changes that are going on in education, you know, from the traditional focus of individual competence, the marking of each kid, to the idea of education as a common good, collaboration, working together. The idea that quality is no longer just PISA scores, but it includes values, ethics, the soft skills, and so on. Moving from teaching for vocation to well-being, you know, of the individual and society at large. The idea of equity, also including gender, sexuality, identity, those kinds of shifts. The idea of STEM, also including the arts, artificial intelligence, all of these areas. And the idea of moving forward to include the skills of reflection, discerning, judgment, understanding alternative facts, you know, those kinds of realism. And so in face of that, UNESCO is now launching about once every generation, every 20, 25 years, it really looks at what is the purpose of education? Why are we doing this? And once we understand the why, then you can question the what, and then the how, and so on. And that is underway now in a program called the Futures of Education. And thousands and thousands of people are engaged. Students are writing in with their perspectives and so on. And I would strongly suggest that Ubuntu look in and take an active role in this whole thing. So anyway, those are some remarks that I hope you find useful. There are ways the International the International Network of Teacher Education Institutions, in which some of you are members. We have restructured, and we now have signed MOUs with universities in roughly 50 countries. And we are poised now to take a lead role with the Education for 2030 roadmap and the framework and the roadmap in looking into research. And we would love to partner with any of your institutions. And certainly if you're interested in the International Association of Universities work, those are all ways in which we can further partner. And of course, within Europe, you have Copernicus, the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, Green Gowns. There are all kinds of other networks for you to look at. But I love the idea of Ubuntu. I hope the Ubuntu's link to the regional centers of expertise for sustainable development is still alive and well. That is moving nicely as well globally, now 175 of these. So anyhow, thank you very much, and I really wish you well with your work in the future.
Charles, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for that lovely offer, invitation to member institutions to look up the network and see how we might get involved in it. And I think we're actually at a point, Charles, where we really are excited about looking at international links and international networks. And we have been doing a little bit of work in that regard in the last few months, actually. So our relationship with Irish Aid is really strong, and we're looking at strengthening it in going forward. So they're very committed to ESD, Dev Ed, Global Citizenship Ed, and Teacher Ed. And so I think now is a really good time for us to look internationally and to create those links and to, link in with Asia, like you said, with the monitoring and evaluation and other institutions that are other institutions or organizations that are really forward in this. So thank you for that. And thank you for an amazing 15-minute tour through ESD from its inception, post-World War II, right up to present day. It's great. There's so many interesting things in there, Charles, and I was interested to see the distinction between ESD and Global Citizenship Ed, because since 2006 when we started, we've always had this kind of, conversation around terms and adjectival educations and what is ESD and what is it not and what's Dev Ed. And I think in the process, we kind of decided to not really care what the terms were, but to try to reorient or try to incorporate justice, equality, sustainability into our teaching. And I think that really ties in with your point that quality education should have all of these things in it anyway, ethics, moral reasoning, all of these kind of things, like an awareness of what's around us locally and globally. So I think if we do our job well and we do it right, we work ourselves out of having a job, because then it's central to education. So it's a really strong point. It's really good. Charles, thank you so much. It's a shame that the time difference doesn't allow you to be with us on Thursday, that this is a recorded interview. But we take your points on board very much, and we thank you for them. And we look forward to engaging with you again in the future.
Yeah.
So
well,
I wish you the very best.
Thank you so much. And your Ubuntu's background in development education would add so much to the discussion. Last week we opened up initiations with international education, internationalizing the curriculum, and we just found we have so much in common. So that imagery of the patchwork quilt with education for sustainability or for a sustainable future is sort of the idea of the quilt, but not its own discipline or anything. Yeah. It's now being seen just as a purpose of education. But,
Charles, is there a term that is kind of transcending all nations, or is everybody describing it as different, the kind of education that we're talking about? Or is it a concern at all to you, the different terms or the different ways of describing it?
The concern I have comes back from my time as a superintendent of curriculum with the Toronto Board of Education. When you add the word education after it, it becomes sort of an adjectival, which we'll get to it when there's spare time in the curriculum, and we'll get to it as, and so that's why I've always been against sustainability education, because it just yet another. Yeah. But in most cases, that's all you can do is to focus it in as a special interest group. So the work that we've been trying to do is to go to the professional associations, whether it's mathematics, language, or whatever, and to form special interest groups within that to explore how you embed the concepts of relevant concepts of sustainability into that particular discipline. But you still need the idea that while no one discipline owns it, and every discipline can contribute something, you still need that way of looking at how do you patch how do you bring the patches together to actually form a meaningful blanket?
Yeah.
And so you need those who assume a bit of leadership, who reach their hand out and to talk to other groups and so on, and bringing it together with realistic ways for education leaders to look at it and say, okay, this will work in our town, our village, our school, and that whole institution approach.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm sorry, it's another long answer, but you know.
No, it's great, Charles. It's great because it is great to revisit that. I suppose we spend so long almost carving out the space of what is DevEd/ESD in order that we could raise awareness of it, that there is always the danger that you then, like you say, make it seem like something that's there beside education as opposed to central to education. So I suppose it's kind of a double-edged sword. In one way, we feel we have to name it and emphasize it and put it into curriculum and into policy. But like you say, the end goal is that you don't see those divisions when it is integral to quality education that's delivered to standards. So that's what we aim for. We aim to make ourselves unemployed. Well, at least me. Everybody else in the network will be fine, just me. So
the
brilliant.
great strength though is that the partnership.
Yeah.
You know, you can reach out like Irish Aid. You can reach out to others where schools can't. So it's how do you capitalize on those strengths but still work inside?
That's it. Yeah. No, thank you, Charles. And I feel we've actually come a long way. Like since you came to us in 2006, we have a national strategy for ESD, albeit not funded. We're seeing this way more in curriculum. We're seeing it as core to teacher education, and more people are getting involved. I know with youth mobilization and with, I suppose, climate change being so evident and the injustices with COVID being so apparent as well, that it is becoming like central to everyone's conversation and discourse. So, you know, we feel we're pushing an open door now, whereas maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago, we were fighting a battle to even be heard. So it's good and it's bad. We really, really need this kind of education now. But I think people are starting to really take it seriously and take it on board. So that's a positive.